Hi everybody, I'm going to walk you through some of my favorite expense-related reports in QuickBooks Online. First, we're going to talk about the very common expenses by vendor summary. Then I'm going to walk you through the transaction list by vendor and some of the customization options you have in there. Then we're going to talk about the profit and loss with a twist by vendor. Then we're going to go in detail in that profit and loss, but we're going to filter it to only show expenses and kind of show you that dynamic there. And then we're going to go into QuickBooks Online Advanced. It's the highest version of QuickBooks Online. So we can do some custom pivot tables. And the examples we will use are expenses by vendor by month, expenses by vendor by the payment account, and expenses by vendor by category. So let's get right through it. Let's go into QuickBooks Online. I'm going to go into Reports, and then Standard Reports. And then I'm going to search where it says type a report name, and then I'm going to type expenses by vendor summary, and I'm going to select that report. This report works really great right off the bat. You get to choose the date range in which you want to do your analysis. So I have this year to date selected. You get to choose whether it's cash or accrual. So cash means that if they're bills, it only shows you bills that were paid during the period of the reporting period. Accrual will include paid and unpaid bills that are dated for that same accrual period, plus all the regular expenses like checks and credit card charges. Now you can compare different periods. So I can compare it to previous year with a dollar change or a percent change. And you can use that as a comparison spot as well. So very common, you would compare last month to the month previous. So either you compare last month with the same month the previous year, or last month with the previous, or last month versus year to date. All sorts of comparisons you can do and get your percent change next to it. Now I'll remove that. So we have a single column. Now you can also click on Customize and you can do a couple of filters. If the underlying transactions contain customer project information, location, or class, you can filter by those. So I can click on class and I can select a particular class that I want to filter by, and then click out of that, and then it will only show me the expenses by vendor in which the underlying transaction contains that class. What does that mean? So I'm actually going to click here, right click, and open a new tab so I can show you the specific transaction on how it contains that specific piece of information. So I'm going to open that up. This one happens to be a journal entry, and then you notice that the class is being used. So at any point in time they're using class, location, or name, in this case, customer job, you can use the filters section to view that. Now, the other thing you can do is you can click on the total dollar amount in the bottom, and it will take you to a detailed report of all the expenses by vendor detailed. So the exact number of transactions that you see in there, they're shown here. As a matter of fact, if you click on this area that says compact 100%, and I click on the drop-down menu, and I click on collapse all, you're actually going to see a very similar report in here because it's almost like a pivot table where it's all collapsed and every single vendor is listed here. And next to each vendor is a number, which are the total number of transactions or transaction lines that affect or that get you to that number. So if you open any of these particular ones that contain a dollar amount, you get to see the two transactions or the transaction lines that add up to the amount that's listed in there. So obviously, the more transactions there are under there, the more rows you will see when you expand each of them individually. You can expand all or collapse all really quick using that button. The next report we're going to look at, let's go back into Reports and Standard Reports, is the transaction list by vendor. So you can search in the search box, put transaction list by vendor, and that will show up in there. Now this report's a little bit different. It does seem similar, but it's a little bit different because the expenses by vendor only shows expense transactions, where the transaction list will show both expense transactions and transactions that are linked to the vendor, but they might not necessarily be expenses. I'm going to do this year to show more transactions here. And you will notice that there's different types of transaction types. There's bills, there's expenses, but there's also bill payment checks. So bill payment checks are technically not expense transactions because that is the payment of an underlying expense transaction, which would be the original bill that that's linked to. So this particular transaction you see here wouldn't show up in an expenses by vendor report, but it will show up as in a transaction list report. Now right here where it says account full name, you can see which accounts these are being paid from. Now if you want to see the underlying expense account that these expenses hit, you actually have to customize this report by clicking on customize, going down into columns, and then going down and looking for item split account. That's just what it's called. I know it's tricky, it's weird. It's called item split account. And that's going to open a new column all the way here in the right. That's going to show you which is the expense category or the category in which that expense is linked to, which is not the same thing as the account where it's being paid from. Those are actually two different distinct types of information that could be useful in an analysis depending on what you're trying to achieve. So right now, this report, I'm going to X out of the customize, is grouped by the vendor. Now I can change that by clicking on customize and going down into groups. And instead of grouping by vendor, I can click on the drop-down menu and I can choose account name. Now what that will do is it will group my vendors. I'm going to collapse these here. It will group all my transactions based on the account that I paid from. So if I paid from the savings account, the checking account, or maybe a company credit card, they will show up in here. So I just have to open each of them and I can see all the transactions. Again, it's a list of transactions that are linked or that were paid from that specific account. Maybe during your analysis, you want to see that. Maybe you don't. So instead of picking account name, I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom or whatever I see item split account. And I'll click on that option. And then now my transactions are now grouped by the category, the expense category, so to speak, that the transaction belongs to. So I can see that there's 2 transactions inside training and conferences. Click on the drop-down menu, and then I can see that there's 2 distinct transactions for 2 different vendors, City of West Midfield and Worldwide Aid, that are grouped into that category. You get to see in the first column here the source account that it was paid from, and then in the major category here that can be collapsed, that's the expense category that is coded to. Now we're going to move on to profit and loss by vendor. Now this is a tricky report because most people actually don't look at profit and loss in this dimension, but you can. So I'm going to click on profit and loss, and then I'm going to click on last month. Oh wait, we're just going to look at last month. And then here where it says display columns by in the drop-down menu, I'm going to select vendor. What this essentially will do is it will still show me a profit and loss, but each of the columns is each of my vendor names. So I can see the information in a whole different dynamic. Now QuickBooks creates all these blank spaces that makes it a little bit tricky to see. And if you have the advanced version of QuickBooks, you can actually modify the way that looks. I'm going to click on customize and then click on where it says visual. And then under visual, I'm going to click on row settings. Then I'm going to click on banded row color. Click on that, and then I'll pick one of these grays. So that immediately makes these columns a lot easier to see. I can also click on grid lines, click on the drop-down menu, which has no grid lines, and click on all borders. And this will look a lot more like a spreadsheet. So it might be just much easier to read as we scroll left and right. I can also click on the new setting called cell settings, and instead of having a blank, I can have it draw a dash. And then that might make it a little bit more obvious that that particular expense category has no transactions that belong to there. Of course, if I expand my date range here and pick multiple months or multiple years, I should see a lot more information being filled in because there's obviously a lot more transactions. So you have to definitely commit to what reporting period you're looking at to be able to do the analysis the way you need to do it. Now again, that profit and loss by vendor doesn't get used very commonly, but it's important to know how you can pull that information. Now I'm going to go back to the reports menu and click on profit and loss. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll all the way down and click on the net income amount. That is going to give me what's called a profit and loss detail. Now, that report actually exists. So if you actually go into the report screen and just type the word detail, you're going to see all the reports that contain detail next to it, including purchases by vendor detail, which is going to contain any bills that you created where you were buying items by vendor. We're not going to cover that in this video, but that's there. So I'm going to go down to our profit and loss detail report and open it from there. So there's basically two ways to get that. Now, a profit and loss contains both income transactions like invoices and sales receipts and expense transactions like bills and that sort of thing. So I can use my customize button on the top right to filter out and only see the transaction types that I want to see. So I'm going to click on filter by, and then I'm going to click on account type. Under account type, I'm going to go into value, and then I'm going to select only to show me expenses. Now I could also include cost of goods sold, which is a kind of expense, and then other expense. Actually, the totality of those three, cost of goods sold, expenses, and other expenses, qualify as the total number of expenses that get in your books. What this will do is it will filter out those transactions, and it will only hit or only show you the transactions that affect those three accounts. Keep in mind that you might still see some invoices because they contain inventory items, and those inventory items affect your cost of goods sold account. But this analysis will let me see all my transactions that are mostly geared towards expenses. Now you can also pick the specific transaction type that you want to see or not. So let's say you don't want to see journal entries. That's easy. You click on add condition. On the drop-down menu for filter by, you're going to look for transaction type. And if it's not in there, we're going to have to enable that in the total number of, or the total displayed columns that you see. So I don't see transaction type, which means I have to X out of filters, go into columns, and look for transaction type as one of the fields that are available. If you find that for whatever reason that field is not available, that's just because that particular report doesn't contain it by default. Now the good news is this profit and loss by detail, which is the most natural way that people go in and create the report, will probably render that limitation where a lot of the transaction types or other fields that you want to bring in, they're not available. So instead, I'm going to show you something that's very similar, but could render better results when it comes to the specific fields. This one is called transaction detail by account. It's actually very similar to a profit and loss detail, but what it does is it really expands all the possibilities of all the transactions you want to see. Now, in order to make this look more like a profit and loss detail, we're going to click on customize, go into filter by, we're going to click on distribution account type. Under values, we're going to select all income and expense accounts. That would immediately give you a profit and loss detail, or very similar to a profit and loss detail, but it'll have as one of the major advantages being able to choose the transaction type that you want to see. So when you click on columns, you see that transaction type is actually one of the fields that is available, which means I'll be able to add a condition in the filter, go to filter by, look for transaction type, and then choose only the transaction types I want to see. So let's say I want to see expense, this one called cash expense, this one called credit card expense, this one called expense, okay? And I want to see, let's say, bills as well. So I filter by those. Let me add a bill. And that should filter just those. Let me go ahead and choose this fiscal year so we get a little bit more information in this report. And now we see formatted like a profit and loss detail, but only with the transaction types expenses, bills, cash expenses, and credit card expenses. So that allows you to do further analysis at this level. Keep in mind if there's any missing fields here, like class or location, which in this case, they're actually there, you will go into customize and then go down into columns And here's where you explore the potential additional fields that you can't see. So you definitely need to go in here and double check what's available, including, for example, customer full name. If you have any customer project assigned to an expense, those will actually show in here. So for example, you see this one that says Cruz Albert Cottage. If I right click on that and click on new tab, we can see that the underlying transaction has a customer project assigned to it. So you'll be able to see that information. So when I go back to transaction detail by account, you guessed it, I can now group these even by class, location, or customer project. So I click on customize, scroll down, click into groups, and then instead of grouping by distribution account, that makes it look like a profit and loss detail, I can do it by location. And then I'm analyzing my expenses, group by location. Of course, I can collapse all if I want to use the discovery mode, where I just want to open each of my locations and look at the individual transactions in there. You can group by class, as we mentioned earlier. So we'll do that. And then you can expand any of the classes so you can see the transactions in there. And you can also do it by customer project. So you see all my customer names. I click on any of them, and then I can see all the transactions that are related to that particular customer project. I'm going to go back to reports and show you some of the advanced functionality in QuickBooks Online Advanced that you can do to specifically pull pivot table style reports. So I'm going to go back to accounts, transaction detail by account, and I'm going to build that list of transactions again. This time around, I'm going to click on, let's say, last fiscal year. So we're going to get a lot of information in this report. I'm going to go into customize on the top right. I'm going to go to filter by. I'm going to select vendor name. And then under condition, I'm going to put not empty, which basically means there has to be a vendor name in the transaction. That will automatically only show me transactions related to vendors and not transactions related to customers. I'm going to add one more condition. I'm going to click on distribution account type. I'm going to click on the drop-down menu, and then I'm going to select expenses, cost of goods sold, and other expense. Again, that's how I only focus on looking at expense type of transactions. So now I have all my transactions in here with all the information. I'm going to go down to groups. And I'm actually going to dissolve the groups. I don't need to see the groups because I'm going to create pivot tables, which are slightly different. I'm going to scroll down in my options and click on where it says pivot. And then I'm going to pick how I want to organize this information. So on the rows, I'm going to select vendor name. And under columns, I'm going to select transaction date and then by month. And most importantly, I have to tell it what the values is going to be, which in this case, I'm going to do amount. By doing these three things, now I can click on this little checkbox that says show pivot tables. And essentially, I get to see a list of all my vendors on the left-hand side and then all the months. So I get to kind of see the progress on where I spend my money by vendor. Now I can use other dimensions that is not by month. So I can select account name here at the top, which is going to represent the source account name or where it was paid from. So really interesting, I can see all my expenses by vendor and I can see where I'm paying them. If you see anything going from the accounts payable account, that's because these were bills. So you don't really get to see where you pay these from when they go when they are coming from bills. But if you're paying directly from the bank account or a cash account or a credit card account, you'll be able to see those. Consequently, if I switch from cash or accrual and I select cash, that is only going to show me the transactions that were paid during that period, the reporting period, whereas the accrual will show me all the transactions that are dated during the period. The last example I give you here for the pivot is instead of picking account name as the column, I'm going to click distribution account. That one's going to show me the specific expense category that I use. So I can actually really appreciate if I used a single vendor for more than one category, which is not always a bad thing, but it does become a big part of the analysis. Now, custom fields become a really tricky part of this, but they do add a lot of flavor. Let me save this report so I don't lose track of what I was doing. I'm going to click on Save As, and I'm going to call this Expenses by Vendor by Category. Click on Save. That way I could always go back to this report and make any edits in the future. So I'm going to click on the Gear menu and go into Custom Fields. I'm going to create a new field when I go to Add Field, and I'm going to create a new field called Vendor Type. From Data Type, I'm going to click on Drop Down List, and then drop down list, I'm going to create a couple of categories: Contractor, Services, Products. Let's just assume for a second that I'm going to group all my vendors based on contractors, people I buy services from, people I buy things from. And under category, I'm going to click on vendor. That way I can assign these as permanent values that go into that specific vendor. Now I'm going to go back into all apps, go into expenses and bills, click on vendors, and then I'm going to categorize a couple of these vendors by those specific custom fields. So let me open up this first vendor, click on edit, scroll down, and assign this one as a contractor. Now, what you use custom fields for, that's going to be based on your own business. That example is maybe not even an example that matters. So let's go to the custom report and let's open up our previous report we created called Expenses by Vendor by Category. Open that up. And we're going to add this new flavor of that vendor type. So we're going to click on Customize. We're going to scroll down to Pivot Table. We're going to unpivot this table. Then I'm going to go into Columns. And essentially my job is to now find that custom field in here. So if I scroll down and I don't see vendor type anywhere here, in the first grouping where it says reorder, I have to click on more columns. And in more columns, I'm going to have to search. So I'm going to type vendor type. And it's right here. It's under transaction, vendor, vendor type. And I'm going to enable that. Once I enable that, I should now see a column with that data. So let me find the transaction. There we go. So now we see all these transactions that are now tagged with that vendor type because we added just a few vendors, which now means I can start pivoting by that specific field. So let me click on Customize again. Let me scroll down, go into Pivot, and then instead of distribution account, I'm going to go look for vendor type, and I can pivot by that. So now you get to see that my expenses are now grouped with vendor type as a column. And that's the power of doing custom reports in QuickBooks Online, particularly when it comes to expenses. Hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next one.